Good evening. And, while you play around with your dessert and sip your wine, you must remember there is at least one amongst you who has had to restrain his wine and is here. I'll make up for it later. Well, actually, Ashley gave most of my speech. Thank you, Ashley. Let me tell you where it all started from. It started from looking at how many children are there on the planet. And incidentally, that's a very difficult number to get. You can search for it and you'll get all sorts of figures from all sorts of websites. A good way is to say that for most human populations, 15% of the population are children. So if there are 6 billion people on the planet, then we should have 1 billion children. Then if you try to look at what these billion children have or don't have, with a bit of guesswork, you can get a pyramid of this kind. There are about 50 million children who have more than what they need for healthcare, for education, for whatever. There are about 200 million children who have adequate resources. They have enough for their healthcare, for their education, and for growing up. And then there are 750 million children who have inadequate resources. That doesn't mean that they don't have anything, but they have less than what they need. And then right at the bottom of the pyramid, you have children who have absolutely nothing. Now, I used to think of that lower 750 million as in the context of developing economies. Until I realized that if you think about it, this pyramid exists in every country. Its shape and size may be different, but every country has these three divisions: children who have more than whatever they need, children who have just enough, and children who have less. So we are not looking at a developing country problem. We're looking at a worldwide problem. Each country has to find its own way. Now the question is, so do you need 3 education systems? Do you need one kind which is class A, that's for the top 50, class B for the 200, and then something else for the 750 below? Or could there be a common solution? Some things which children have told me: when I need to know something, at the time when I need to know it, I can find out in 5 minutes. Now, how do you get that child to sit in a classroom with that thought in his head? Another pretty damning statement from England. My father is an engineer, but he doesn't have a job. This is from northeastern England, which has this glorious engineering history of shipbuilding for navies of the world and so on and so forth. Now, this little fellow has heard this from his parents. How do you get him to do STEM? Why should he, with that thought in his head? Another one, a favorite of mine. Why should I work hard to be a professor like you when I can earn as much by driving a bus? This is not a weak attempt at increasing my salary, but it is a genuine emotion in the child's head. It's ironic because a generation works very hard to develop, to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, and when you succeed, the children stop aspiring because they say, well, I can do anything now. Why do I need to work hard? On the other side of the world, you have different statements. We can't use the computer room when we want. It's not allowed. This is the Indian Victorian education system where things are allowed and not allowed in capital letters. Okay? Another statement from a school which is not a particularly poor school. The internet is down because the school didn't pay. Now, the principal of the school decided that he needed to build a couple of bathrooms, toilets. And he needed the budget for it, so he said, well, let's look at what we're spending money on. What's this rubbish internet? Let's just stop it. So the internet went down. So when you put it all together, you get two kinds of problems. You get problems of relevance and aspiration, and you have problems of resources. But I must again point out that these are not two problems of two sides of the world, of the North and the South, or the developed and the developing. Every country has both problems, to greater and lesser extent. Let me illustrate that. Well, first of all, I started with this statement about 12 years ago that there are places on the planet where, for whatever reason, the reasons may be different, but you cannot build a good school, or even more importantly, you cannot get good teachers either cannot or do not want to go. I used to think again that this was a developing country problem, India, China, Africa, until I realized that no matter which country you come from, imagine the map of your country, imagine that you have a pencil in your hand, and you can draw little circles for me and say, well, we're going to have a problem there. This is serious because the places where you can't get those good teachers to go for whatever reason are usually the places where you get all the trouble coming from. So again, an ironic problem, good teachers don't get to those places where they're needed the most. And they end up in the more affluent places where perhaps education could have happened by other means. An example, this is a graph. On the y-axis, it shows the total marks for English, mathematics, and science. On the x-axis is the distance from New Delhi in India into rural India, avoiding all the built-up places. All the schools are the same. They have the same funding. They're all government schools. They have the same number of teachers, the same number of students. Why do they get worse and worse? We had a long discussion in my previous office in India about this. And we went through some horrible hypotheses. For example, rural children are more stupid than urban children. I could discover no psychological basis for saying anything like that, so that couldn't be true. Clever people live in cities. I couldn't find much basis for that either, but I did find the answer to why this graph existed. It was because teachers wanted to move towards the more urban places. And they wanted to move towards more urban places because they're human beings. I mean, urban places have better healthcare, better sanitation, better entertainment. So the good teachers migrated. When I asked the government agreed. Yes, they said teacher migration is a serious problem. So when I came to the UK, I thought, well, now here's a good way to check if I'm right, because here is a developed economy, so there isn't that much difference between rural and urban. So there's no particular reason why somebody would say, I only will work in cities. I should get a much more uniform school result. The UK's school examination is called the GCSE. So I took the GCSE results and looked at them, and I found, to my surprise, that they were not uniform. There were some very good schools, and there were some very bad schools. What would explain that in a developed economy? I tried looking for a correlation and found a strange one. On the y-axis here, the GCSE results. On the x-axis, an interesting number, I need to explain that to you. It's the density of council housing. Now, council housing in England is government-subsidized housing for families who are, economically depressed, or they don't have a job, or there's illness, or there's, some problem or the other. So these are government-aided housing. And some areas have lots of such houses, and some areas have less. So if you take the density of government housing and you plot it against GCSE, you get the same downward curve as you get with geographical remoteness in India. So I started going to the higher council density areas to see what was happening. And the same government schools with the same funding and everything would look a lot dirtier, graffiti on the walls, teachers complaining it's not really very safe to go out after dark, and it's not really the same problems as we had with geography in India. So then I realized that remoteness can be defined differently for different countries. But there are remote areas inside every country, inside every state, inside every city. It can be geographical remoteness, as we saw in India. It can be socio-economic remoteness, as we see in England. It could be religious remoteness. It could be ethnic remoteness, genetic remoteness. It can be a dozen different ways, because of which teachers will either avoid a certain place or people will want to go away. So what can we do about that sort of thing? About 12 years ago, I was working in New Delhi, and my job was to make curriculum and materials and pedagogy to develop software engineers in a large private sector company called NIIT. So I was doing this, and I wasn't very happy with one fact, which is that these courses were highly priced, and they were attended by children whose parents had a lot of money. Just outside the campus that we had was a large, sprawling urban slum. Now, there were lots of children in that slum, and I thought, is there any reason to believe that these children will not make just as good software engineers as the ones who come to my school? But how would I ever get a good computer teacher to go and teach inside that slum? I couldn't. So I decided I wanted to try an experiment. What would happen if I just took a computer and put it in a slum? So my colleague said that there isn't much of a research question here, you see, because the computer will be broken, its parts will be stolen and sold. So I nevertheless wanted to try it, and I did manage to convince my boss that I wanted to do this. The next problem I faced was, where in a slum do you put a computer? You can't just take a table and put a computer on that and turn it on. You couldn't do that in Half Moon Bay. I mean, it'll just disappear in about 20 minutes' time. So computers, are not meant to be kept outdoors. Either somebody will get it or the weather will get it. They'll just stop functioning. The only model I could find was that of a bank, who have traditionally put computers outdoors, the ATM. So I made myself a DIY ATM. Okay, you can see that over there. And I stuck it into a wall, a nice big screen computer. It's 3 feet off the ground. It's running Internet Explorer with altavista.com on it in those days. The children don't know any English, barely go to school, they've never seen a computer before, never heard of the internet. I then told a colleague of mine to take a video camera and wander around the place discreetly and record for me the destruction of this computer. After about 8 hours, he came back in. There's a colleague called Vivek. Vivek came running back in, and he said, it's very strange, but children are browsing on the computer, and they're teaching each other to browse. So I said, well, that's really surprising. I mean, how could that happen? So then everybody got together and said, this is very simple. Inside your campus, you've got 3,000 young, educated software engineers. So one of them was passing by, saw the children struggling with this computer. They showed them how to use the mouse. So I thought, well, that makes absolute sense. Let me try it elsewhere then. Let me try it in a place where the chances of a passing computer engineer are minimal. So I then selected a village in northeastern India, quite a remote place, and I put in a computer in their school. They didn't have an English language teacher because no English language teacher would actually go and work in that place. And the children sort of went to school sometimes, again, never seen a computer before. I returned after 2 months, and I found a little boy and a girl playing some kind of a Microsoft game on that computer. And as soon as they saw me, they said, oh, we need a faster processor and a better mouse. So that was my introduction to, underdevelopment. So then I sort of asked them, how do you know all this? And they said, Well, you've given us a computer that works only in English, so we taught ourselves English in order to use it. Very simple. Then I thought, well, they're using two positives. If I teach myself the language, then I can use the machine. If I had given it to an adult, he would have said, if I can't understand the language, I cannot use the machine. So how come children use two positives and adults use two negatives? When do the two positives of childhood change into the two negatives of adulthood, and who does it? And as a teacher, I began to get a little, nervous about this. So, however, that experiment showed that they could actually still navigate. We then tried the experiment over and over and over again. I got some World Bank funding to show that these were not freaks. We had statistical evidence that it would work everywhere. We tried it in village after village, about 23 of them, and found a couple of other very strange things. Just to give you one example, in one village in the western deserts of Rajasthan in India, they have a peculiar habit, which is that all the children sing. They sing pretty lovely desert songs. And when you ask them, why do you do this? Why do you sing and teach each other to sing? They have a very interesting explanation. They say it doesn't cost any money. So, it's lovely. So into that village, BBC put in a computer and they said, look, you can come with us, don't open your mouth. We'll put the computer and we'll check whether whatever you say happens actually does happen. And in that village, what happened was actually beyond my wildest imaginations. In about 12 hours, the children discovered the sound recorder, sang into it, and for the first time in their lives listened to their own singing. A great piece of learning for educators that children will go for, as Ashley mentioned, the children will go for what interests them, and they will find it whichever way, as long as that interest exists. Here are a few glimpses of those years. This was the first hole in the wall. The boy on the right is 10. His father sells cigarettes outside. To his left, his student, a little too short for the computer. Here's my Rajasthan desert kids. A downloaded game. So remember the context. This is completely unsupervised access happening in one village after the other. So I started to measure it, and I took a computing literacy scale on the y-axis and number of months on the other, and it was a straight upward learning curve, ending at about 43%. If I took that same test and I gave it to all of you right now, we would get about 43, 44%. It's everything that we do: email, surfing, browsing, searching for information, videos, increasingly these days Facebook, Twitter. Everything that we do was getting done over there in 9 months amongst each other. So at the end of that first period, we came to this conclusion that groups of children can learn to use computers and the internet on their own, and a great line of hope, I thought, irrespective of who or where they are. So with those results, I then began to get a little curious about what else might they be doing with that computer. So we moved to the second phase of the experiment from 2002 to 2005, where I wanted to actually carry out a few harder tasks. The first one that we took on was in the city of Hyderabad in southern India. Now, Hyderabad is a big, sprawling city, and it has a a surprising thing. It has thousands of little private schools, not for rich people, but for poor people. And the poor people spend a few dollars a month sending their children to these schools because of only one promise, that they'll be taught good English. And learning good English at that strata of Hyderabad society would make a huge change to the lives of these children. But something was going wrong. The schools were teaching good grammar, good punctuation, spelling, that sort of thing. But no native English language speaker would go and teach in a Hyderabad slum school. So the children were picking up the accent of the local teachers. The local language is Telugu, and it's a very strong accent. So when they would apply for a job, the interview board would say, well, you seem to know very good English, your English seems to be very good, but we can't understand anything that you're saying. So you can't get a job. So now here was a problem that was a pedagogical problem. I went into one of the schools and I bought them a computer. And into that computer, I loaded a speech-to-text software. We had to buy those in those days. Now you get it free with Windows. You speak into the computer and the computer will type out whatever you're saying if it understands you. So I loaded this in and I called some children and I said, look, just talk into the computer. They spoke into the computer and it produced complete nonsense. So the children laughed and said, it doesn't understand anything of what we are saying. So I said, fine, I'll leave it here for 2 months. You have to make yourself understood. The children then said, how? And I invented a new method. I said, I have no idea. And anyway, I'm going away. So I left them, I went off, I came back after 2 months. When I came back, it's a predominantly Muslim area. It's a little boy, Faizan, was standing outside the classroom. So I asked him, Faizan, how are you? Faizan says to me, fantastic. So I said, I said, gosh, what's going on in here? I discovered what was going on. After I left, they had downloaded the Talking Oxford Dictionary. And they were constructing sentences with it. Oxford Dictionary would say it to them. They would repeat it back into the sound recorder, take the voice file, submit it to the speech-to-text engine, see how many words were coming out right, criticize each other's pronunciation. In other words, I had left the learners with a learning problem and no pedagogy. They had invented the pedagogy. So my point was that whatever they did with their pronunciation, but they had invented a pedagogy. That learners are not supposed to do that, remember? We are supposed to invent pedagogy for them. Who are they to invent pedagogy? But they had done it, and here's a short glimpse of it.
Yes, he's my cousin.
Yes, he's my cousin.
Yes, he's my cousin.
3 children talking. And by the way, that girl, she's now about 19 or something, and some of you may actually have spoken to her because she works for a call center in Hyderabad. I came to know this in my last visit. So, from a speech-to-text machine. So at the end of this, so then I thought these were really surprising. At this point, I got a call from a famous person, the late Sir Arthur C. Clarke. He was still alive. He was in Colombo, the science fiction writer, the inventor of the satellite, actually. He said, look, I've been following your experiments, and I'm very interested, so can you come and talk about it to me? So I went to Colombo. I met him, and he said 2 things, both of which are, I think, very important for educators to remember. The first one was, a teacher that can be replaced by a machine should be. Okay? So double-edged sort of thing. The second one, not so tricky, but very deep. The second one, if children have interest, education happens. Okay, both very important. So armed with both of these, I went and started to experiment all over India, Africa, Cambodia with how much or how far can children go. And here are some glimpses of that.
As much as possible, and they can undoubtedly
help people because the children very quickly learn to navigate the web and find things which interest them. And when you've got interest, then you have education.
Yeah, this machine, I play games like animals, and I listen to music. I am 15 years.
'I've got 5 rows with 3 in each row. How many goodies do I have altogether? Let's try again.
Ăn cho nhiều để mũi cả. Đập ram, đập ram. Lư nó lư. Đâu đâu.
Click go when you're ready.
Okay, incredible, isn't it? Street side. In the meanwhile, in the streets of New Delhi, the computers had been there for about 9 months, and the teachers were beginning to say some very interesting things. They said, you know, the children's English has improved dramatically, and the quality of their work has changed completely. It's become very deep. I thought to myself, how can a DIY ATM do all this? You know, there has to be something more. So I went and talked to the children and discovered what had happened. 6 months down the line, they had found Google, and by Googling their homework. So, and I thought to myself, oh my God, what have I done? Because, you know, naturally their English is very nice, naturally their stuff is very deep learning and everything, but how is this learning? So I wouldn't get an answer to that question until many years later, several years later, and I would get the answer of all places from Gateshead, England, but that's what the rest of the story is about. So at this point, I concluded that groups of children can learn to achieve educational objectives on their own. They can do it by themselves. Up to now, the teaching community was very fond of me. You know, they said, it's lovely. You know, they can learn computers by themselves. They can change their pronunciation by themselves, even though we are not there. When I put this one down, they were, you know, they became a little grim. And they said, well, I won't tell you. Then I went later on. Around this time, a colleague of mine in Newcastle University in UK, James Tooley, got several £million worth of aid, for research money, to, of all things, improve the quality of schooling in Hyderabad, India. So he called me straight away and he said, look, you're the guy who should be doing this. So I said, well, I'm only 2 hours away from Hyderabad. I'll help you. And then he said, no, you can't handle £2 million of university money sitting in New Delhi. So in the winter of 2006, I had to buy myself an overcoat and move to Newcastle. So having moved to Newcastle, I had a sort of a similar meeting to this one with my colleagues. I explained what the work was, and they said, you are perhaps getting a little senile. So I said, why is that? And so they said, look, it was fine when you said they can do computers on their own. It was fine when you said they can do pronunciation on their own, play games on their own. Now you're saying they can do everything on their own. That's not on. So I said, well, the only way to answer this is to design an experiment to show that there are some things that children cannot teach themselves. So we designed an experiment. It was to be done in the village called Kali Kuppam in southern India. The research question was as follows. Tamil is the local language spoken there. Can Tamil-speaking 12-year-olds in a tsunami-hit village in southern India teach themselves the biotechnology of DNA replication in English from a street-side computer? And I thought this was going to be a cinch. They'll get a 0 to start with, they'll get a 0 to end with, and they'll come back to Newcastle and say, we'll need teachers. So off I went to Kali Kuppam, and it really had been hit by the tsunami. It was completely wiped out. I had given the children 2 computers to play with, 2 hole-in-the-wall computers. So I called 26 of them as an experimental group. I downloaded some material into the computer on DNA replication. And I said to them, look, I've put in something very interesting in here. It's all in English. and it could be really hard, but if you like, you can have a look at it. So the children, of course, immediately rushed off to look, and they said it's full of diagrams and equations, and they said, I mean, how are we going to understand this? So I used my method and said, I have actually no idea, and anyway, I'm going away. So I went off, and I came back after my usual 2 months. I had pre-tested them, and they had got a statistical 0. I called the 26 children. This time they came in, they were very quiet. So I asked them, what have you understood? So they said nothing. So I thought, well, it's a little children, what else could I expect? So I said, well, how many times did you look at it before you decided that you understood nothing? So they said, no, we haven't given up on that. We're looking at it every day. So I said, for 2 months, you were looking at something that you didn't understand at all every day. What for? So then this girl whose ribbon you can see, she was 12 years old at that time. She raised her hand. And she says to me in this broken Tamil English, she says, apart from the fact that improper replication of the DNA molecule causes genetic disease, we've understood nothing else. So then I sort of, a great lesson for educators that the bars that children set for themselves today can be a lot higher than the bars that we set for them. So when a child says, I haven't understood anything, don't take him at face value. So I then post-tested them. And, well, here's a little glimpse of Kuppam itself. So that's the hole-in-the-wall computer. I'm just going to skip this little bit and go on to the next. Can you just click ahead? Yeah. So what we got on the post-test was an educational impossibility. From a 0 to 30% in 2 months, unsupervised. Remember the context again, Tamil-speaking, 12-year-old, tsunami hit with his roadside computer, the DNA replication in English, 0 to 30%. But I still couldn't go back to Newcastle because 30% is a fail. So how do I get them to pass? How will I get a biotechnology teacher to go to Kuppam? I couldn't find one. But what I did find was a 22-year-old accountant, a young girl, who was a great friend of the children. So she would play football with them. So I called this girl and I said, look, can you help me? Can you teach them a little more biotechnology? So she says, no, I can't because I didn't have any science in school. I have no idea of this subject at all. So I said to her, well, let's try this. Use the method of the grandmother. So she says, what's that? I said, stand behind the children and admire them. Every time they do something right, just say, wow, what a fantastic thing you've done there. When I was your age, I couldn't have done anything like that. How do you kids understand so much about computers? So she did that very effectively for 2 months. The scores rose to 50%. Same as the posh schools of New Delhi with trained biotechnology teachers. I took the results, took me years to publish them, but by the way, all this is now published in the British Journal of Educational Technology September issue. It's quite something. I mean, this is not supposed to happen. So I went back with these results back to Newcastle and I said, I'm sorry, I haven't found the limit at all. So then I went off into the schools of Gateshead. That's a little town across the river from Newcastle. And I started to work with the schools there because now everybody was interested in what was going on. I took 32 10-year-olds. Now here's how it goes. I took 32 10-year-olds. I told them, divide yourselves up into groups of 4. I don't know who your friends are, so make whatever group of 4 you want. Where do I get the number 4 from? It was the ideal number in the hole in the wall. Most of the time they work in groups of 4 or 5. So the children did that. Then I said, okay, every group can use only one computer and not 4 computers. So that we did that. Then I said, if you don't like your group, you can go and join another group. You can talk within your group, you can talk across groups. You can go over to another group, peer over their shoulders, see what they're doing, come back to your own group and claim it as your idea. And I explained that I work in a university and a lot of research is done using these methods. So they were, like you, they were very happy with this. Then I had my most difficult problem, which was I told the teacher that, can you leave the classroom? And she said, no, I can't. It's not allowed by law. I can't leave them alone. So I had to beg and cajole her and said, look, we'll keep the door open. We'll stand outside. We'll have a cup of tea. The cup of tea always does it in England. So she went off to have a cup of tea. I then gave the children 6 GCSE questions. These are questions that they will see 6 years from now when they're 16 at the end of school. And I left them alone. The best group solved all 6 correctly in 20 minutes, the worst in 45. The teachers came back and said, so what? They're Googling the stuff, they're looking at Wikipedia, they're talking to each other. One of them claimed that she had seen a girl call her father on the mobile phone. So they're using all this. So I said, well, but they've answered the questions. Why don't we do a little experiment? I'll come back in 2 months, which I did, and I'll give them a paper test. Every child sitting alone by himself or herself, you cannot talk to each other, you can't look at each other's work, no computers, and let's give them the 6 questions back. When I had done it the first time, they got a score of 76% on the average. When I did it the second time, I got an anomalous result, 76%. I then asked the teachers, now what's this going on? And the teachers said, this is amazing. They seem to have photographic recall of what they did on that day. I think it has something to do with the group work. I don't think a single child with a single computer would have remembered with that kind of clarity. But they were arguing with each other in the group. They were going across and seeing what other people are doing. And the teachers said they're reproducing the screens with the diagrams in them and everything, as though they had photographed it in their minds. But it was still recall. Are they learning anything? Well, eventually, and this now brings me to absolutely current work, eventually we tested for learning. And I'm very happy to say that there is learning, there's deep learning happening. They're able to use knowledge picked up from one exercise in another social context. To give you an example, I once took a group of 9-year-olds and I told them, today, let's do fractals. Fractals is what you do in second year postgraduate mathematics. So they said, what's that? They're a very confident lot now. They're very used to my method. So they said, what's that? I said, fractals, So they said, spell it. So I spelled it. I spelled it. And off they went. The Mandelbrot set, the Julia set, the beautiful drawings. Okay, you can't expect them to understand higher mathematics, but they went into fractals. So I thought, this is good enough. Some time went by. And the teachers said, what have you done with these kids? Because they're all going around talking only about fractals all the time. I took them out to a camping trip, and they kept looking at the trees and saying, those leaves, they're all fractals. The flowers, they're all fractals. The clouds, they're all fractals. One of the parents came and said, what are you doing in math? Because my little boy, I gave him a pineapple to eat, and instead of eating it, he was just staring at the whole thing and said, Mom, the skin is a fractal. so then, they were continuously Googling and discussing fractals. So they were using concepts across from one way to the other. But we know that this method will give us, not everything, but it will give us 30%. We know that from Kalikuppam. Where do I get the grandmother from? So I put out an appeal in the Guardian newspaper saying, if you are a grandmother, and if you have broadband with a web camera, then can you give me 1 hour of your time every week for free? Grandmothers turned out to be a very energetic lot. I got 200, okay, of whom 40 qualified with all the correct equipment and everything, and they got to work. They are now called the Granny Cloud. And whenever required, I beamed them over Skype into the slum schools of Hyderabad, or into the schools of Columbia, or into Melbourne, or wherever. These 40 mostly retired women with decades of experience, they've done over 500 hours of instruction with some of the poorest children on the planet. It's a wonderful equation. The children love their British grannies. They appear as full size on their walls. The grannies themselves, they've finished their life's work, and as one of them put it very poignantly, she said, I would have never thought that my house would be full of children's voices again. So it worked just fantastically well. So 30% on their own, triggered off by a question, the balance with the beamed-in grannies. Okay, here's a glimpse of how that looks. This is Gateshead, England.
You can't catch me. You say it. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. Well done. Very good. So again.
And meanwhile in Gateshead, this little girl is explaining Hinduism to me and taught me several things I didn't know.
The word Durga in Sanskrit means a fort or a place which is difficult to... We went into Google.
These two boys wanted to be footballers.
We went into Portal and we typed in Leonardo da Vinci.
After 8 hours, they wanted to be Leonardo da Vinci. This is an Indian mediator coming into what's called a self-organized learning environment. So the question is, how far can we go? Two little examples and I'll stop. I went to Turin, Italy, and worked with a group of 30 10-year-olds. I asked their teachers, can you leave us? And the teachers said, no, we can't, because you speak only English, they speak only Italian. How are you going to communicate? So I said, actually, I have no idea, but can you leave us anyway? So I managed to get rid of them. They went outside. I wrote down a question on the whiteboard in English. So the children looked at me blankly. The question was, how did dinosaurs die out? So they looked at me blankly and shrugged. So I said, what, don't you understand? No. By the way, I'd got the teachers to make the groups of 4 before that. So then I said, well, then shall we call the teachers back? So they, with horror, they said, no, don't call them back. So we will do it. So then what they did was, they typed in the English question into Google Translate, got the Italian, went into the Italian internet and solved the question. So then I started writing more questions, making it harder and harder. Now here's what happened. So 20 minutes later, they had the 2 main theories of why dinosaurs died out. Next one was simple. It was, where is Calcutta? And they did that in 10 minutes. Then I got really ambitious. Who was Pythagoras and what did he do? These are 10-year-olds, so there was silence for a while. Then one of them comes up to me and he says, you spelled that wrong.
Ma che cos'è? Chi era? Era un matematico.
20 minutes later, the right angle triangles start to come up. So one of the kids was actually taking Pythagoras' equation, typing it back into Google, and he was heading straight towards the, those Lagrangian equations or whatever it is, special theory of relativity. The Italian teachers came back in, and it's a very poignant moment for me, because one of them said to me, "Stop them." And I thought, well, is that what's wrong with the system then? Should we? Or should we just let them go? I still don't know the answer. Could you skip this one, please? I'm out of time on this. So, here are the conclusions. Information search and analysis and reading comprehension, it seems to me, are the two most important skills that we need in elementary education. Children in the age group of 8 to 12, if they have sufficient amount of reading comprehension and information search and retrieval skills, can go, as you saw, as far as you would like them to, or as far as you let them. The assessment systems have to match up with all of this. I don't understand why a child should be asked if he knows how to multiply numbers. Why is that so important? Or to work out the square root of a number by hand. Why is it so important? The children don't understand that either. And that's why they don't like going to school. What you can do is you can ask them really, really hard questions. You can, so just as one last little example, take Google Earth. I did this a little while ago. Google Earth onto Geneva. You can see clearly the Large Hadron Collider, 26 kilometers long, circling. Then I did something really risky. Showed them a picture of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And I said, that one in Geneva, it's bigger, and it's our cathedral. So now the children are listening. So they say, you know what happens in there? Particles move at the speed of light. 2 rings of them in 2 different directions. We smash them against each other. And then we find out what comes. We are looking for the Higgs boson. The children then said, can you spell that? You can drive them in any direction with questions. You don't need to give them answers because they have all the answers. They can find the answers. If they can read, if they can understand, and if they have a rational belief system, you can get them to do anything on their own if you can trigger them off with the right kind of question. Your job, our job, the educator's job is to redefine the curriculum as questions. If you do that, then you convert education into a self-organizing system. When it becomes a self-organizing system, it can't be stopped anymore. And you could make a really, really big change. I did a little calculation, and it works out to 5 cents per child per day. And you could get all the children on the planet to think differently, to think in this way in under 10 years. Well, there are a lot of children, so it works out to $180 billion. But it's not a lot of money, actually, for the change that we can make. And that's about it. I think I may be allowed now to drink a glass of wine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions?
Questions, comments? Yeah.
I have a mic for you.
I just want to know what the next project is.
Okay. I'm trying to do something which is... thank you for asking that. The thing is, this whole thing needs a theory now. It needs a theory on how exactly it works. And I actually left a couple of slides at the end because, I told the story. But there is a subject which I think is going to play the same role in human development as physics did in the 20th century. That is the science of self-organizing systems. I think that education, in the context in which we saw it, was behaving like a self-organizing system. In a self-organizing system, you get emergent phenomenon. For example, you have dust lying around, you have a breeze blowing, you get a little dust devil that forms and moves around. There is nothing in the dust which says that there should be spirals in there. There's nothing in the wind which says that there should be. It just happens. It's emergent phenomenon. I think if you speculate that education, if it is a self-organizing system, then could it be that learning is the emergent phenomenon, and which is why when it happens, we're so shocked by it. So where did that come from? Now, how does one go about, well, thank you very much for putting that up. So here's my speculation. Emergence is the appearance of a property not previously observed. This is the guess. I think it can be, we can show it in 5 years. It needs a lab. It needs a lab, and I can't do that lab in a developed country because the laws won't allow it. I need a place where nothing else can be built. And I know such a place. I'm actually lucky enough to know a place in India where the government says, look, we can't do anything here. Whatever you do will be good. If one can have a lab, and one has to do it ethically, correctly, if one had a lab, if one had 5 years, if one could show that emergent phenomenon is what drives education, then you could actually predict. Then you could actually build a physics of education. So you do a longitudinal study, see what happens to those children, build the physics, and once you've done that, you can actually predict. You can say, given this kind of children, given this kind of an environment, given these inputs, this is what is likely to happen. And in that understanding, I think, lies the future of learning. It's a long answer to a short question.
So I was wondering if in your experiments in Italy or England, if the kids in their groups of 4 were given any sort of incentive, or was it made into any kind of a competition in order to drive the fastness of their learning?
Well, with the 8 to 12-year-olds, the opposite is, it's important to realize that it's the opposite. We don't want them to compete. Because remember, the group rules are telling them not to compete. They're saying you can even go and cheat from another group. It doesn't matter. Getting to the answer is important. But what I do is I do give an intro to start the whole thing off. A couple of words that work very well. You tell them, today we're going to do an experiment. Children love that word, okay? We're going to do an experiment today. We are going to demonstrate that learning can happen. You can use words of as big as you like. That learning is an emergent phenomenon in the speculation that education, you tell them all that, they'll all listen to that. So, okay, so we'll do, so what's the experiment? That's one way. The other way is that how you frame the question is absolutely all important. So please, it is not about not having teachers. It makes the teacher's job really hard, really difficult, because you have to think of the question in the right way. Let's say for a moment that you want to teach them trigonometry. No child on the planet today, I think, understands why you're doing it to them. You know, they don't know why you're doing this. Why are you doing about the angles and so on and so forth? I'll tell you a very short example. In one of the Gateshead schools, I have a really tall teacher, Emma, very good teacher. So I asked the children, they're all 9 years old. I asked them, well, how tall is Emma? Oh, very tall. So how will you measure her height? We'll put her against the wall, we'll put a cardboard on top of her head, we'll draw a line, we'll take... I said, Emma Crawley is not going to let you climb all over you. So how can you measure her without touching her? Oh, we don't know. Okay, can you measure how far away she is? Yes. Okay, lie down over there, point a scale at the top of her head, and measure the angle. So the children say, measure the what? They're 9 years old. Measure the what? The angle. But they're my kids. They worked for a year with me, so their next question is, how do you spell that? Okay. So I spell it for them. So then they say, well, and then, so I said, then there are 3 magic words. The tangent of an angle. So, can you spell that? Okay, tangent of an angle. It took them only 3 sessions of 40 minutes each. Adjacent upon hypotenuse, the distance, the angle, the tangent of the angle. Okay, again you might say, did they really understand trigonometry? Is it believable? I don't believe it myself. But the point is they got her height. Okay? So, I don't know, how are we going to assess this? How are you going to assess this? Okay, I've partially answered your question, but I want to leave a little puzzle, which is, if I have Google, and if I can pretend to be a civil engineer, how long can I get away with it? You know, there are various estimates. It actually depends on the profession. If I was pretending to be a financial analyst, I can probably get away with it forever. So the thing is that if I can, then instead of saying that I'm cheating, couldn't you say that I am a web-enabled financial analyst, which means I should be certified as such. So I think we need sort of totally different kinds of assessment now that people will have or do have Google in their pockets. Remember the time when arithmetic went into all our pockets because of the calculator. Today, how important is it to know how to multiply or to know how to add, as opposed to knowing what multiplication means and what addition means. But other than that, whether you can or cannot add, it's not important at all. When on earth do you need to add? You know? So if you're going to be hired as a supermarket till clerk, is it important to know whether you can add? The answer is actually no. You just need to be able to feed in what is to be charged, what has been paid. And then you need to know how to open the drawer and count the money. That's what all. So why don't we just accept the fact that one skill has got de-skilled? Addition. So that's, yes, please.
Dr. Mitra, on the other side, sir.
Where are you? Oh, okay.
We've got a question. Based on your instincts, is the greater challenge for educators to not get in the way, or is the greater challenge for educators to find value beyond what kids can do on their own? And this is a more conversational question than a statistical one.
Well, the kinds of problems that I've faced quite often in teachers trying to use it is that a lot of teachers find it very difficult to step back. They're kind of constrained to say, you know, when should I not? Example, in a class, disorder. You know, this method is very prone to disorder. So there's shouting, fighting, people pushing each other, and so on. The teacher says, what am I supposed to do? Sit back? And the answer is yes. What I did in that class, and what I do now regularly, is I appointed a policeman. So I said, look, we are having a law and order problem here. And if you don't want us to get up and interfere with your studies, then you appoint a policeman and you look after your law and order. It works perfectly. They love to be policemen, one of them. And then you tell them you maintain law and order without the use of force. And, and anytime you see a problem, you just say, Constable, just go and fix that, there's trouble over there. And they sort that out. So learning to step back. And the second thing, triggering the question correctly. The third thing, if they don't get the answer, which also happens sometimes, then the teacher comes back and says, your method doesn't work. And I say, no, you have to say to yourself, your question didn't work. You asked the wrong question. And if you can train yourself to do that, then you can, if one didn't work, you ask another one. If you got a partial answer, ask the balance. Don't tell them the balance, just ask the balance as another question. Okay? And there are some absolutely incredible instances. Recently, question, which was a bad question, was World War II good or bad? I think that's not a fair question to 10-year-olds. So they were given that, and then the teacher comes up to me and says, I'm okay, they found out lots of things, but I'm not quite happy. You know, they missed the whole of the Holocaust. So I said, what? They missed the whole of the Holocaust? I can't believe this. So I went and talked to them. The answer, well, this part will make you happy. Do you know why they missed the whole of the Holocaust? They censored it. They told me later on with little voices, saying it isn't good to write about that. Now, how's that? So these things will happen. You can find a child sleeping. I found a child sleeping on the table. They hadn't. So the teacher again said, should I not now move in? So move in and do what? Wake him up? So I said, I'll wake him up. I go there. I say, Scott. His name is Scott. I says, Scott, are you sleeping? He says, yes, as a matter of fact, I was sleeping, he says. So I said to him, Didn't you like the question? No, it was a very nice question. And why were you sleeping? Because I found the answer. He says, So, it's such great misconception. That teacher would have come to the conclusion he is not engaging with the class and, let us find out if he's autistic or, has a learning disability, this and that. Probably drugged him, shocked him, chopped his head off. But a poor fellow, he solved the damn problem and he was sleeping. So give them a chance and step back. I think all this stuff, has to go into the teacher training curriculum. That's the sort of positive action that if we put this into the heads of young teachers, they will take it to the next step forward. Just one thing that you almost ask is that at the next level, if you go to the adolescents, it works in a different way completely. Adolescents have a different approach to life. So if you tell the adolescents, make yourselves into groups of 4, the adolescent will say, do I have to? So then, I've tried it only a few times in English schools. A good answer is, I don't really care what you do. So you can do whatever you like. I would have liked for you to do trigonometry, but since you won't, you can do whatever you want. I'm not interested. Adolescents hate not having some attention paid to them all the time, which is what they're trying to do every time they act in that way. So that worked well with me. The other one that worked very well with me is to say, I've come all the way from India to do this. In India, anyway, 10-year-olds do this better than you guys do. So I'm not going to be particularly interested in what you do. That gets their goat. So use all manner of fair and foul means. You can get the adolescents in. And they love the idea of the teacher stepping back. Once they trust you, and by the way, it won't work the first time you do it in almost any group because the children don't trust you at all. They think there's a trick. They think there's going to be an exam. They think that you're going to find out who shouts the most and then go and punish him. So it takes about 2, 3, 4 tries before they are convinced that you are really, really doing it this way. Once that happens, then they'll do anything for you.
So I totally agree with your premise that students, I write math curriculum, right? So I totally agree with your premise that students often say, why do I need to learn this? My concern, though, and you'll forgive me, I guess, for being kind of the resident cynic, is that it stands in contrast not only to just the way that we've constructed education, but just human history. As I understand what you're saying, I could take a second grader and assume, in a very Socratic method, that they know, they have an inherent understanding of trigonometric ratios and the differential equations and the law of relativity, and all it would take to elicit that would be a question from me and Google. I have an impossible time believing that a 7-year-old knows the theory of relativity, right? And the reason I think that is because it took thousands of years for Einstein to come along and come up with it. So I get the cachet of looking at an educational system that seems broken and saying, well, we should just get rid of the educational system and just ask questions. I get that. But I also get that there is a certain virtue in kind of the paternalism in adults saying, there are things that you need to know, and if we don't ask you, then you're not going to get there. But it is important that you can take the derivative of something. And that's where school is, to some degree, valuable. So I wonder if you can kind of talk to that tension. And let me just throw one other thing out there. I wonder whether the kids were learning anything or whether they were regurgitating things that they were finding on Wikipedia. Because the one thing that I didn't see was kids actually asking questions. You can ask them, who's Pythagoras? And a robot can answer that. Like, Google already has the answer to that. But I didn't see them actually taking that information and then turning it into something that we would define as creative, where creative is creating something that didn't exist. That's not on Wikipedia yet.
Okay, I have several ways to answer that, actually. I've, by the way, thought about and been asked this many times, as you might imagine. Well, to take your question in parts. First of all, are there things that we need to say to a student? You need to learn this because I'm asking you to learn it. And you won't understand the reason why you're learning this until much, much later. is that an inherent part of how curriculum is, or is it a shortcoming of the adult brain in not being able to explain the reason? I'm not very sure of that. But children, of course, detest it because they look at it as talking down. And I honestly haven't found anything which cannot be framed into a question that will make you mildly curious, including the theory of relativity. If you say, when things move fast, they become shorter. The people say, of course not. How can things become shorter when they move? And you start off the whole chain that way. Do they really understand? Depends on what you mean by understanding and to what depth you want them to understand. Do they understand it as well as a C-grade undergraduate student understands it? The answer is definitely yes. Because he's regurgitating as much as the 7-year-old is. So that's not the situation you're talking about is the ideal learning situation. Do they reach that? I don't know. But I have a counter question. What is the official measure of deep learning? Well, in the United Kingdom, there is an examination called GCSE. If you can answer the questions, if you can answer 50% of the questions in that examination, you don't need to go to school anymore. You're schooled. There is no other definition of schooling. So until I see another definition of schooling which is measurable, until I see a measure for what is deep learning, the ability to use knowledge gained in one context, used in another context. But where are the tests? Where's the measure? If there is no measure, I'll use 19th century physicist thinking, and I'll say if there is no measure, it doesn't exist. So let's not waste time on it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.